Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. In the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful, the one God to whom all praise is due forever, the Lord of the worlds. Welcome to episode 2 of Bilal's Boulder. I have a very special guest with me today, and his name is Yusuf al-Andalusi. Yusuf al-Andalusi is a professor of Islamic and religious studies, and he's also taught Islamic aesthetics. He has taught in many countries, including the UK, Canada, Iran, and Pakistan. Welcome.
Walaikum salam. Thank you so much, Brother Bilal.
How are you doing?
Alhamdulillah. Can't complain.
Alhamdulillah. So let's jump right into it. What drew you to studying and teaching Islamic aesthetics?
I think that what drew me to aesthetics was the fact that Islamic arts and Islamic aesthetics, of course, is fundamental aspect of my conversion to Islam, which the process of which started when I was 11 years old, and I chanced upon a picture of a miniature, a Persian miniature from the Safavid period, from Sultan Muhammad representing the Miraj of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And I remember 11 years old, 11, 12 years old, being absolutely awestruck by that picture and literally falling in love with it and wondering basically about two questions, namely, first of all, who is this person whom God loves so much that he draws this person to himself, like one draws a mirror towards one's face, and then of course the question of who was this man who actually inspired an entire civilization to produce such wonderful works of art. And this is where, slowly at my own, innocent level, I started inquiring about Islam, but also other religions. And this is how this process started, which ended up basically with me, doing my Shahada at the age of 32.
So I'm just going to take a wild guess. Actually, we've talked about this before, so it's not really a wild guess. But this is the picture that you're referring to, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And do you know who painted this picture?
Yeah, so this artist, his name is Sultan Muhammad. He was a Safavid miniaturist, and this is his most famous work. Also, his last one. This is his last sort of great work before he died. And this picture in particular actually is interesting because it conveys a lot of Islamic doctrine in just one picture. It has first of all the ascending movement, meaning that in the Islamic tradition, progress is an upward process. It's not a horizontal one. We progress spiritually. We progress by getting closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It does not mean that we, as a civilization, oppose technical invention and so on and so forth. Far from it. I think 14th century of Islamic history have clearly proven that we have been beacons of civilization for the rest of the world, and that our present sense of inferiority is completely unjustified. No, that's not the case. But it should never be at the expense of the first revelation, which is, as you know, the first book, so to speak, the one that came with Adam alayhi salam, was the cosmos itself. And I think we should really have a reflection on this. I mean, Ayatollah Jawad Amali, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala lengthen his life, has written an entire book on Islam and environments. I think we really need to reflect as Muslims on our responsibility towards the environment, because it's the first book that has been revealed. These are the first ayats that have been revealed. The universe, there's a good reason why in Arabic the universe. Al-alam is basically derived from the same root as ilm. So in a sense, al-alam, if you go through the rules of creating words in Arabic, al-alam is the thing through which you get to know something, right? So the universe was created for us to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through his sign, through his ayat, which is basically all of the creation around us. And to destroy it, to damage it, is literally an act of blasphemy. And that is why also Islam as such, as a civilization, is completely incompatible with modernity, and especially with neoliberal capitalism. Absolutely incompatible. And people, unfortunately, have not thought about it thoroughly, and are giving into an ideology that is utterly satanic, and which is nothing short but rebelling against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the coming back to that picture, so there's this upward movement, right, which signifies our duty to basically ascend spiritually, to seek to ascend spiritually through the inner quest. It's just not enough to follow fiqh. Fiqh is extremely important, by the way, but it should also be complemented by the spiritual quest. And this is something that you find in the great Arafah of both Sunni and Shia Islam. This has been actually the life work of Imam Ghazali, for example, in his Ihya al-Ulumuddin and his Kimya Sa'adat, making sure that people understand that there's a zahir, an exterior aspect, an exoteric aspect to the religion, but also an esoteric, an interior aspect of the religion that actually is the life of the religion itself. Likewise, we have, in the Shia tradition, similar characters. The most famous ones at the moment, because of recent events, are of course Allama Tabatabai, rahmatullah alayhi, and Imam Khomeini, rahmatullah alayhi. But also there were great Arafah of the past who emphasized on this notion that the fundamental aspect of the religion is, of course, this quest, this upward quest towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's really beautifully described in this picture. But then at the same time, whilst creation is supposed to ascend towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what you notice in this picture is that the angels are all centered around the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, meaning that creation ascends towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and it's beautifully represented. So in this picture, you have a fundamental aspects of the Islamic tradition represented here. And I could go on. I mean, could go on for hours about this picture. It's a marvelous piece of art, and it's actually worth its own program. I think maybe because I'm planning to do podcasts myself, maybe I should dedicate an entire program to it.
Inshallah, I think a lot of people would be happy to hear from you with regards to a podcast. There's a lot that you just said that needs to be unpacked. But one ayah, for example, that comes to mind is Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. سنريهم آياتنا في الآفاق وفي أنفسهم حتى يتبين لهم أنه الحق. And we will show them our signs from within themselves and from the horizons until it becomes clear that He is the truth, that He is al-Haq. So this is the idea that the self is a microcosm and that our surroundings are a macrocosm that are to be studied objectively, and that the conclusions of that study and that reflection would result in a presuppositionless knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that does get into learning not just from the self but from nature, and therefore from aesthetics. So this actually brings us to the next question, which is, why did the Prophet, what did the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the early Muslims teach us about art and calligraphy and architecture?
Well, I think before we go into this, I think we need to sort of deconstruct a few things. The way we perceive art as this separate aspect of life in something that you find in museums and in galleries, of course, does not exist in Islamic civilization. The arts are supposed to be available to everyone, and that was also the case at the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In order to understand this, we need to understand that the hadith of Jibreel alayhi salam, the hadith of Jibreel is a fundamental hadith in the Islamic tradition, whereby the deen is described as having three fundamental dimensions: Islam, Iman, and Ihsan. And so Islam here in this particular hadith is a reference to basically the exterior aspects of the religion, is fundamentally fiqh. So Islam is what you do with your body, right? In terms of your relations to other people, to yourself, to the state, to your country, to your parents, and so forth, and towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Then you have Iman, which has to do with what you do with your intellect. And again, we're clashing here with modernity. Faith is perceived by modern people as being a feeling, whereas the Islamic tradition, first of all, describes it as a ruh, but also as an act of the will. So what it does is that the mind presents to the will a certain number of propositions, such as, for example, there's a heaven, there's a hell, there's a God, there's a prophet, there's a revelation, and the will acquiesces to it. And that's faith. Likewise, love is not a feeling, but it's an act of the will. Being in love is a feeling, but love as an act is actually an act of the will. It's the desire. It's desiring the good of the other as other. And so that's love. It's an act of the will. So that's it. Of course, an act of the intellect, of the aql, basically. So iman is what you do with your aql. Ihsan is what you do with your nafs. And it's beautiful. The beautiful thing about this is that ihsan is actually derives from the root hasana, basically, which refers to the notions of both good and beautiful and beauty. And so very often we hear this reproach by Western specialists of Islam that, well, Islam doesn't have a proper school of aesthetics. I would argue, just like Sheikh Hamza Yusuf actually does very, very well, actually, I would argue that the entire spiritual aspect of the Islamic tradition is actually a branch of aesthetics, because aesthetics is actually it's actually the fundamental aspect of Islamic spirituality. It's about beautifying the self, right? And when one understands this, and one understands that, you know, the hadith of the Prophet is very clear about it, that Allah is beautiful and He loves beauty. Yeah, absolutely. So when one understands it, then every single act that we practice should be beautiful. So the recitation of the Quran has to be beautiful, and therefore it has all of these different rules, right? It also leaves space as well for a certain type of creativity. The way we build our mosques, the way we build our houses, the way we plan our cities, all of that has to be done with beauty in mind. In fact, I would state that Islam as a civilization, more than any other civilization, really put beauty as a civilizational imperative. Now, with beauty come a certain number of other values, namely justice, because you can't contemplate beauty if your stomach's empty. There needs to be a minimum of justice that it administered to the rest of the population, so that the entirety of the population can actually contemplate beauty and contemplate that on the aspect of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So beauty is not some side aspect of Islam, it's actually quite fundamental to it. And one of the tragedies of the contemporary Muslim world is that having accepted this mental slavery by which it considers itself inferior to the West, and we see this in the way, for example, all over the Middle East, we see men dressing in Western clothes rather than their own, or entire cities being rebuilt in using modern Western architecture, which is absolutely not adapted to the climate, by the way, and does not survive time. And is just simply not adapted to the prescriptions of the Sunnah either. So what we do find is that with the arrival of modernity in the Muslim lands, we have a mutilation of Islam that takes place, and it's not only at the level of doctrines, of movements, but also at the level of what type of values are being conveyed through architecture. So let me give you an example. You can have a form of government that claims to be Islamic, but if everyone in that state basically wears Western clothes and only has Western architecture and Western sports and so forth to fall back on, it's basically saying that the 14 centuries of Islamic civilization were not good enough to provide the citizens of that state with clothes, with architecture, with urban planning that is basically worth the name. And so therefore, even though in name the state might call itself Islamic, as is the case, for example, of Pakistan. Pakistan on paper is an Islamic republic, but in actuality what you have is Pakistan is being ruled by a certain number of highly westernized, upper-class, aristocratic land-owning families that are exploiting the majority of the people in absolutely atrocious way, and imposing westernization in a way that is quite brutal and makes the rest of the population think that they're backward and inferior. And of course, the problem is when you build mosques in this sort of ugly, contemporary, modern type of architecture, what the message you're giving is that functionality basically is more important than beauty. Well, once that happens, then you're basically saying that ihsan has no significance in the Islamic tradition. And that so when it comes to prayer, that the only thing that really matters is you going through the motions. But this whole aspect of ihsan is absolutely not important. So once you create ugly mosques, you create an ugly Islam, and you create ugly Muslims. And I cannot state enough how these modern architects in the Muslim world are doing a job that I would say is just as horrible as the barbarians of Daesh, ISIS, because what they're doing is they're destroying Islamic civilization, not by destroying historical monuments, but by imposing an architecture that is actually telling human beings that they have no soul, that they have no other dimension to themselves other than being units within neoliberal economy. And that is a crime, because what you're saying is that again, that the Islamic revelation, that the Sunnah and so forth is completely irrelevant, and it's something that I think the overwhelming majority of Muslims nowadays have not really thought about, but I think is really at the root of many of the problems that we're having as societies.
So when we reinforce the separation between church and state, or church and society, or in this case Islam as a ethical religious tradition, and what is considered utility or what's considered practical. You further reinforce this in the city planning and in the architecture. You highlighted a lot of really good and important points, but one question that I've always thought of is, if the diaspora community wanted to build a masjid in the West, we have a few options in terms of design. Let's say price is not a factor here. We can make it look something like the mosques in the East, which the problem with that is, in many cases, that does not fit the architectural style of the neighborhood or of the skyline or what have you. Another option is to look how other traditional buildings were constructed in the West. So, for example, cathedrals with that Gothic style or Gothic architecture. But the problem with that is we don't want to be just, there are traditions on tashabbuh bil kufar, just copying aspects of other religions being something that's discouraged in Islam. And then the third option in my mind is having a mosque that looks like the existing buildings. But again, the existing buildings are built completely from a utilitarian angle and not from an angle that highlights the importance of beauty. So if I were to build a mosque here in Canada, what design should I be aiming towards?
That's a very interesting question. I think, first of all, of course, there's the whole issue of diasporic Islam, which
we can
in and of
the
itself.
Grievances of that.
We can. I mean, it's
that
as you know, I have loads to say about this, but diasporic problem. I mean, to cut it short, I mean, diasporic Islam is problematic for one reason: is that economic migration in the Islamic tradition, and Shias and Sunnis, in terms of fiqh, agree on that, is actually completely forbidden. Leaving Darul Islam to go to Bilal al-Kufr is actually completely forbidden. So first of all, here you already have a fundamental problem here. You have people who've left the Darul Islam to basically go to a country that is fundamentally different from theirs. Now, the rulings normally when one leaves Darul Islam to live in another civilization, so to speak, is that one adapts one's outward appearance in order to adapt. That does not include the hijab, of course, but as long as the fundamental aspects of religion are actually kept. So I would say the same for architecture, right? Now here's the thing, though. It's that there's a whole variety of styles within Western and Eastern architecture where we can have meeting points and adapt the architecture to the local environment. So, for example, you have in Scandinavia, you have these wooden churches that actually resemble pretty much Kashmiri architecture in northern Pakistan. And which looks nothing like what we usually, what Middle Easterners would think of as a mosque. There's no domes. What you have is these towers, these tower-like, arrow-shaped,
Is it in Iceland, you said?
Mostly Norway and Sweden.
Okay.
Yeah. So you have traditional Russian architecture, Orthodox architecture that has, very interesting features that can be adapted to a Western setting. So it's just really a matter of researching a type of architectural language that is adapted to the, for example, right? Yeah, absolutely. So if you compare this
for the viewers, I literally just searched Norway wooden church. I mean, you do get a few designs. I mean, this is another one, for example.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah,
and now
if you can,
absolutely. Yeah. And if you compare this to, for example, architecture in Kashmir, right? So if you compare this to architecture in Kashmir, then you find a lot of similarities. and so that it doesn't look too odd, too strange, too foreign. Because the problem is, of course, with diasporic Islam is that diasporic Muslims confirm every single stereotype that Westerners may have about Islam. And especially because many of them have sort of become the one of the branches of the extreme left, they confirm absolutely. Yeah, so that's Kashmiri architecture, right? So they make Islam look foreign, whereas Islam is a universal tradition that is open to everyone, and there's no reason why in the middle of London you should have a mosque built in the Mughal style. That makes absolutely no sense whatsoever.
That's been my critique as well. And in fact, I just had a post written yesterday about the otherization of mosques, of churches, of synagogues, where they just become a temple of a particular identity, as opposed to a reflection of that community and the needs of that community. I think in many cases our mosques are just something transported from Turkey or from Iran or from Arabia, and just just dropped right into the middle of an otherwise very gray and very glassy urban
and that's at best.
Yeah, and
That's
that's at best. In most cases,
when they're
the
not
mosques just look like
yeah.
warehouses, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean it's absolutely terrible. And then they wonder. I mean, people come up to me and it's like, "Oh, Doc Professor, my son is leaving Islam." Well, sorry, but it's your fault. You first of all, you brought him to Bilal al-Kufr and into an education system that promotes values that are fundamentally against our tradition. First of all, in a culture that is, radically opposed to it as well, and you yourself have no knowledge of the religion. And then you bring your son to a warehouse with a fake roof with like neon lights, where some cleric, some badly paid cleric who came from Pakistan is giving a speech in Urdu or Punjabi or whatever other language that your son doesn't understand. Well, of course he's gonna leave Islam, and him leaving Islam is entirely on your head.
So,
Right.
some of us have a very complicated reason why we may be in the West. I mean, my family in particular.
Yeah, of course. I mean, like, your family is a completely different case, right?
But what I've always said is that as long as somebody is involved in some way in the Dawah initiative, in other words, that you come here not just seeking money and not just seeking an education or white women or what have you, but you come here with a purpose in mind and with a mission at heart, and you with an unshakable identity. Because, like you mentioned, if someone were to move somewhere in fear that he's going to be misled or misguided, then going to that place is not permissible.
Absolutely.
And I think the only case where that would be permissible is if you do not fear that you're going to lose your religion, so you're going to go somewhere where Muslims are properly integrated and a part of the society, not just in the kind of doctor and engineer sense, but also are people that are makers and movers and shifters in the society, and have an influence on the culture there. But on another level, you need to come and support the Dawah initiative. You need to come and be open to teaching people about Islam, or at the very least supporting those who are teaching people about Islam. And you're not just here for a degree and a passport. And this is on a whole different note, and inshallah we'll have our chance to
we'll talk about it.
But on a different note, I mean, many people, especially in the United States, especially in these like very urban blue state, people from New York and California, and Dearborn and elsewhere, they really believe that being American is just having the passport, and they think that they're just as American as some guy who's been there for generations and whose ancestors fought in the Civil War. Okay,
yeah, absolutely.
I'm sorry, but that's not the same thing. Just
absolutely
because you have
not.
the passport, it doesn't mean that you're an Anglo-Saxon.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that you necessarily understand your surroundings or the culture in which you've integrated. It doesn't even mean that you've integrated, actually. especially in a postmodern world, and especially in a world where a lot of us are really just working or studying and then coming home and living a completely different life from people that live just adjacent to us. So,
Absolutely.
But I digress. We'll get into that at some point, inshallah. But yeah, going back to the question, would you say that the Prophet ﷺ taught something about art besides? I understand the idea that ihsan is obviously an inseparable part of religion, and that, in fact, I've been saying for a while that ethics is a branch of aesthetics. That aesthetics here is the asl, it is the root, and that really ethics is a part of that. It actually branches out of
absolutely.
that. But when I talk about architectural style or artistic style, about painting, about calligraphy, in the way that it's manifested or the way that it's expressed, are there any instructions given to us?
Yeah, so as we know, the first scribe of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was Imam Ali alayhi salam, who is considered by all schools of calligraphy in Islam, and this transcends the religious divides. He was considered the founder of Islamic calligraphy, and Imam Ali alayhi salam has several hadith on, for example, cutting the pen, and we have recipes for ink going back to Imam Ja'far Sadiq alayhi salam. So, for example, the ink that I buy normally is by Mr. Sayyid Shabistari, who's a manufacturer of inks in Tehran. And so his recipe for ink goes back to Ibn Sina, who's got it from Jabir ibn Hayyan, who's got it from Imam Ja'far Sadiq alayhi salam. So, so we have these instructions, and of course we have instructions on the necessity of writing beautifully, right?
Just to jump right into that. I have seen some references to Ali, as you mentioned, Sayyidina Ali, telling people or instructing scribes to actually bring the letters of words very close to one another, and to separate the words and give ample spaces between the words. And similarly, I've also seen a reference to many people will write the basmala in Arabic. Basically, in Arabic, the shorthand, the ba can connect to the meme without drawing what we call the teeth on the scene. So we'll just go from ba right all to the meme. And so there's apparently an early effort to not do that shorthand for the basmala specifically, in order to respect its sanctity, and to actually take the effort to drawing those curvatures. Go ahead, brother.
So and then you have, of course, the construction of the mosque itself, right? The mosque of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is a model for the rest of the mosques in the Muslim world, right? So what you have is the idea of a courtyard with a section of it that is covered. Of course, there's a certain number of considerations of theological considerations that are given to it, and also historical ones. Namely the link with pre-Islamic Jewish tradition, the whole tradition of the tabernacle that you and I discussed in the past, and you've done a lot of research about this.
I've also posted about it on my page at some point.
Absolutely.
I'll put the link in the comments.
Absolutely. So Islamic architecture and calligraphy in particular, and of course the recitation of the Quran as such as well. All of these go back to the Islamic tradition, as well as, of course, the sartorial tradition in Islam as well. These all go back to the Prophet and his immaculate family. Of course, apart from these few instructions, that there's very little there that we could like nowadays call like instruction manuals. These are not there, but that's then the job of the artisans and craftsmen to basically do that. I think the concepts are there, definitely. It's the implementation that basically, differs. I'm sorry, that is in the hands of the craftsman. And also, I do believe that the Prophet ﷺ wanted to keep the tradition as universal as possible, so as to be able to, because the thing is this, if you enter into the specifics of, for example, of architecture, what you're doing is that you'd be Arabizing Islamic architecture, which would be extremely problematic, right? I mean, it would become something like Sikhism, a tradition, a religious tradition that is so intimately tied to
Punjabi
specific aspects of Punjabi culture that it becomes very difficult to export it elsewhere. So there are some general principles about how to build a mosque, but otherwise, when it comes to style, then there seems to be a relative freedom and space for creativity, right?
You,
I
you
think
need somewhat of a blank canvas for the artist to be able
Well, although
to
not
express.
entirely blank, but yeah, there's a great room for diversity there, and Islamic tradition has a wonderful diversity when it comes to architecture. I would recommend this beautiful documentary called Paradise Found, which is about specifically about Islamic architecture. It's absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, that's right. Moving on, what are some distinguishing features between Islamic aesthetics and that of Greco-Roman or Hellenic culture?
Yeah. So in terms of architecture, or actually the arts in general,
I guess arts in general.
yeah, there's a great deal of emphasis on mathematics, much more so than in the Greek tradition. For Islam in particular, mathematics becomes fundamental in the sense that, given that it's a tradition that does not rely on subjectivity, but actually considers beauty to be an objective reality beyond our own perception. So, to make it quite blunt and clear, in the Islamic tradition, beauty is not in the eye of the beholder; it's the ability to perceive beauty that is in the eye of the beholder. So something
I suppose
is.
that maybe the Neoplatonists would agree with that as well.
No, absolutely, and I mean, the Islamic philosophical tradition owes quite a great deal to the Neoplatonists for that on that notion. Plotinus, for example, states that beauty comes in two forms, right? In two aspects. One is beauty through form, and the other is beauty through actions. And this is exactly what we find also in the Islamic tradition. But these two have objectively verifiable, non-subjective, norms to them. So mathematics becomes the language through which beauty expresses itself, and not just in Islamic tradition, but actually in everyday life, right? When we see the face of someone beautiful, the beauty of the person has to do with notions such as, for example, the golden ratio, being expressed in that person's face, right?
That's right.
Now, one has to distinguish, of course, beauty from attraction. Finding something beautiful does not necessarily mean you're attracted to it. And being attracted by something does not necessarily mean that thing is beautiful,
That's
right? I'll give you a very silly example, but John Malkovich is not what one would call a classical example of male beauty.
I don't know
He
who
had
that
a great.
is. I'll have to
John
look him up.
Malkovich is a famous actor.
John Malkovich. What was he in?
He was in Dangerous Liaisons. He was in. He plays more into sort of like these artsy movies. Yeah. So he's by far not let's say an example of canonical male beauty, right? But a lot of women do find him extremely attractive because of his charisma, because of the way he plays. And this is again where people need to, for example, contemporary modern people don't make this distinction between beauty and attraction. So Christina Aguilera, when she says, you're beautiful, whatever what they say, no, Christina, that's not how it works. You may be attractive to a great deal of people. You may be attractive to not attractive to a great deal of other people, but that's completely different from the question of beauty, right? So that's why Islam has, as a civilization, has put so much emphasis on mathematics, because mathematics has got nothing to do with the subjective. It's a universal, objective language that is used everywhere. The rules of mathematics apply everywhere, wherever you are. And so that's why geometry in particular plays so much a role in Islamic architecture, but not only architecture, but also in calligraphy, right?
Every so often, I find, sorry to interrupt you, brother, but every so often you find a pearl of wisdom found in some of the teachings of, and this is going to get me some controversy, but the Nation of Islam, as you know, one of the historical interests of mine. One of the quotes attributed to Master Farad Muhammad, the founder of the Nation of Islam, was, "Islam is mathematics, and mathematics is Islam."
Yeah.
Going into the objectivity of truth, something that can be not just appreciated but also proven. At
Absolutely.
Any point in time.
It's not. You see, it's got nothing to do with this modern idea that faith is something that, you're sitting on the beach contemplating the sun, setting down, listening to some inspirational music, and then you suddenly feel something. You feel that there's a God out there. Well, that feeling might just be a poutine that you haven't digested properly. I mean, it could just be anything.
Especially in this.
There's people who feel all kinds of things towards all kinds of, there's people, there's people who cry sincere tears of love for when they see the Ganges polluted in Benares in India, because they believe that the Ganges is a manifestation of God as a river, right? It's all beautiful and whatever, but is it true? It is, right? So so the Islamic tradition does not concern itself with let's say the emotional or subjective concept of beauty. It's although it definitely,
you say it harnesses it on a cultural level. Through the creativity of the artist.
Yeah, absolutely.
The basis of this architectural style or this artistic style would be something rooted or based in basically objectivity, and logic and math being
absolutely.
Well,
although there's also other dimensions. Although, for example, you have these huge differences between, for example, Timurid Safavid art, and I say Timurid/Safavid art because although they're different styles, there's this historical continuity between Timurid and Safavid art, at least in Iran. And then, for example, the Mughals. There's certain differences. The Mughals, Mughal art and Mughal architecture and Ottoman architecture are more down to earth. Safavid architecture is literally psychedelic in its use of geometry. Absolutely. And there's some speculation as to how this may have been influenced by the fact that many of the murshid masters, but that's the name that traditional architects actually have in Iran. That the traditional murshids in Iran are tied to the Khaksar Sufi order, which it's an order where entheogenic experience is actually not rare at all, and so which makes plain the idea that in many in many shrines created during the Safavid period, you have this sort of simulation of a mystical experience going on there. So again, as I've just described here, and of course, geometrical patterns and fractals are extremely important in these sort of experiences, and that gets reflected in the architecture. But that's just speculation on my part. I need to do more research on that. But it seems to be that there might be a case for this.
Well, yeah, you see that in many cases. Sorry to interrupt you again, but and everything that you're sharing, mashallah, is very valuable. You see it in the case of the shrine of Masuma in Qom, where you see that there are angels holding the pillars, and that's based on theological concepts as well as mystical experiences of people seeing the angels holding the throne. Of course, with the concept which is mentioned in the Quran.
Absolutely.
So in many cases, the mosque was a theater in which the theology and mysticism of a people was to be expressed.
Oh, absolutely.
Whether you see it in the oneness of God expressed in the dome of the mosque, the patterns that are on the domes, whether it's the verses of the Quran mentioned in calligraphy on the walls of the masjid, or in the case of the Kaaba on the kiswa itself. Or it's in the like you mentioned, the patterns and its reflection of theological and mystical concepts.
No, absolutely. The Shrine of Hazrat Masum is actually a very beautiful example, because so much effort has been put into its construction, and also because you can see different epochs, different time periods of Islamic architecture being expressed in it, including the more recent aisle that has been built in the 90s, and which has caused quite a great deal of controversy because it broke away from the rest of the building in terms of architectural style. But you can absolutely see this, and actually I'm doing my present research about the Shrine of Hazrat Masuma, and there's a great deal to be said about this shrine. It's probably one of my favorites examples of Islamic architecture.
In Jerusalem, of course, the Qubat al-Sakhra, the Dome of the Rock. Whenever I look, I'm not an architectural student or an expert in any sense, but when I do look at it, I do feel like many experts have not even understood it, really, because this is a building that doesn't even really have a clear mihrab for a qibla. The building itself is kind of decorated in a way where it is almost designed as a qibla or designed as an epicenter. And there is some speculation that perhaps the early Umayyads who were designing that mosque, because as you know, there was a particular point in time where the Umayyads did not have access to Hijaz and so Mecca and Medina, because it was under the rule of Abdullah ibn Zubayr, who was separate from the Umayyad dynasty during the early years. And had his own control over the Hijaz. And so when you look at Qubat al-Sakhra, it is geometrically designed to be a type of qibla or a type of epicenter.
Absolutely.
Where attention is drawn to the center of the building as opposed to a mihrab pointing towards Mecca. So that again, that's some speculation on my end, but I mean, I think that we're not even at the tip of the iceberg in terms of understanding that building.
Well, another aspect to take into consideration regarding that particular building, regarding the Dome of the Rock, is that so there's some basic codes, geometrical codes to be taken into consideration when speaking of Islamic architecture. So the square, the octagon, and the circle represent different things. So the circle represents the Lahut, the divine realm. The octagon represents the Malakut, the angelic realm. And then the square represents the earth. And what's quite interesting is that the Dome of the Rock, which is linked to the event of the heavenly ascension of the Prophet ﷺ, is actually octagonal in shape. So it relates to a Malakuti dimension because of the event that it actually commemorates.
Very good point. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it definitely also has to do with the function that you've described as well, right? I mean, there's no, in my mind, I think there's no doubt that that dimension is there as well.
Those are some really good points. Moving forward, how do we reconcile narrations on showing the blessings of God in our fashion and appearance on one hand, with narrations on asceticism and on keeping simple?
Well, let me put it this way: you may be a beggar, but your attachment to money could be such that you're actually more greedy than, for example, a king living in a palace, who himself may be completely detached from worldly concerns because he lives a life of piety. Asceticism it's got not much. I mean, it isn't as such.
It's not about what you own; it's about what owns you.
Absolutely, it's not about. It's not about what you possess or what you're attached to, but rather it's the things you're bound to by either marriage or other things, but it's how detached are you from these things. So, for example, if I mean, I'll give my own example here. I'm a very occasional smoker. I don't smoke regularly at all. So I'll have my cigarillo, shisha, once in a while. Like maybe, I don't know, once a week or maybe twice a month. I mean, I'm very, I don't smoke that often.
I think the jury is still out on that practice as it is, but yeah.
Sorry?
I think the jury is still out on shisha.
Yeah. But in a sense, because for me it's about I don't like this. I would like it to remain a pleasure, not a habit. And I like this idea of control. So when I feel that for example, if I see that I'm smoking every day, then I'll just stop before it becomes a habit. And that's basically, I mean, that's what Zuhd is about, right? That's what asceticism is about. It's making sure that certain things don't own you. And likewise, when it comes to architecture and so, and I mean, I'll give you the example of Aurangzeb, who was, the last great Mughal. He lived in, luscious palaces, but he himself led an ascetic lifestyle. He knitted his own. He knitted skull caps and wrote Qur'ans and sold them, and sold them to and gave the money to for charity. He ate simple meals. I mean, had a quite frugal lifestyle compared to his predecessors. And even though he was living in a absolutely luxurious environment, yeah, I mean, one does not contradict the other. I'm reminded of a narration where one of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam was seen wearing a quite beautiful garment, and someone criticized him, and then the Imam comes up to him and then shows him the a cloak made of coarse camel hair that was actually itching his skin, showing him that even though outwardly he was wearing these really nice looking clothes, he was still practicing asceticism. Mm-hmm. So one does not not necessarily contradict the other. I think this whole cult of let me put it this way: the radical left has put up this idea that anything that sort of outwardly expresses privilege or of course beauty and so on and so forth should basically be let me rephrase it. the radical left basically sees beauty as an expression of privilege.
Yeah.
Because of it, and because the radical left is actually led by resentment, they want to abolish it because, according to them, everyone should live in a world full of ugliness, and preferably, of course, their own ugliness. And this is why you also have this trend amongst a lot of young Muslims to basically do away with the aesthetics of traditional Islam. So and what you have nowadays is you have young people who are completely detached now from the centers of learning of the Islamic tradition, who are trying to spread Islam using, for example, rap, right? So we have this particular band in North America, Dean Squad, that, yeah, is an absolute disaster. I mean, absolutely disgusting.
May Allah guide us all.
Yeah, I will try to control myself here regarding these people. But yeah, I mean, we know from the fiqh, first of all, that using the tunes of Ghina for religious purpose is absolutely forbidden. And that band in particular has been using famous tunes that are linked to that are considered Ghina, to basically talk about religious matters. But beyond that, it's this sort of very flashy, sort of like bling bling, neoliberal type of, how to put it.
Yeah, no,
Prosperity.
it's just a form of consumer and kind of pedestrian
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
entertainment.
it's basically an Islamic version of like prosperity evangelical Christianity. It's absolutely disgusting, and the consequences of doing away with the traditional aesthetics in the Islamic tradition it's the appearance of such people, actually such disgusting people, may I add. Whereas you have other people actually, do use music to convey the message of Islam in a very tasteful way. I mean, take Sami Yusuf. Especially his latest work is actually quite commendable. It bridges the gap between Western and Eastern music in actually quite a nice way.
I believe he's written a dissertation on the subject of music and Islam.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this is a very informed practitioner of music. I mean, someone who actually also plays several classical instruments from the Islamic tradition. So it's not some wannabe gangster rappers who who are really giving the Islamic tradition we're giving a really bad image of Islam, and actually also confirming a whole great deal of stereotypes about Muslims as well, as being thugs and so on and so forth. It's yeah.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of younger people. I've worked with many young Muslims, teenagers especially, because I've worked in Islamic schools, and so I know that there is this need for teenagers to feel like they are cool, or to feel like they're loved, or feel like they are hip, or feel like they're in tune with everybody around them. And so Dean Squad will offer some of those young Muslims that feeling that, look, these are, very popular songs that are, being given a Muslim spin. It's kind of Islamizing pop culture. I think where the problem lies is that if the root and the framework of pop culture is something that is built upon misguidance, then
absolutely
you can't just give Satan, a hijab and just...
No, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, well, but moving on, and again, I don't know too much about them, and I hope the best for them, but no, this is just cultural critique, which I think is needed. I think for public individuals to be accountable to their actions that are public. So I do think that there is... So when we look at the prophetic mosque, when we look at the Kaaba, when we look at the actual sanctuaries that were established by the Prophet, there is this sort of simplicity that kind of reminds me of Japanese art and Japanese architecture and aesthetics, as opposed to some of the more extravagant mosques that we see in the Safavid and Mughal period. So do you think that Islamic art ideally should be more simple, or do you think uh, diversity is welcomed here?
No, no. I think diversity should definitely be welcome here, simply because of even the diversity of the religious experience of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself. So, because there's an earthly dimension to the Prophet's life, but there's also a celestial one, and the celestial one is one that, of course, is exuberant, colorful, complicated, dazzling. And so the different styles of Islamic architecture, for example, if you take the earthen, so the clay mosques in, for example, West Africa, they are very sort of, they're very extremely simple in many ways. And you compare them, for example, to, let's say, the mosques from the Safavid period, you couldn't find more. I mean, it's a contrast of night and day, really. But the thing is that they're all part of the same tradition, and they choose to highlight a different aspect of the tradition. And yes, the Prophet in his earthly, let's say, manifestation, definitely conveyed values of simplicity, of authenticity. But then Safavid architecture it does not try to what Safavid architecture tries to do is convey us a sense of the celestial and really transport us beyond ourselves and give us a sense of transcendence, and it does it extremely well. Actually, it's quite overwhelming, and so that we leave those mosques, those shrines, with a sort of sense of having traveled to another realm. That's also part of the Islamic tradition. Likewise, brother, I would like to highlight Zen aesthetics is only one of many schools within Japan. Mm-hmm. So, for example, traditional aesthetics really started with in the 7th or 8th century with Kukai, also known as Kobo Daishi, who was the founder of the Shingon school of Japanese Buddhism. Now, he brought to Japan a series of tantric teachings, but also came with a great deal of forms of art, so for example, for example, ikebana, the art of arranging flowers, and Japanese gardening and so forth. But for example, the art that comes from that what actually is now normally considered as classical Japanese aesthetics relies a lot on symmetry, on geometrical patterns, just like in Islamic tradition. Mm-hmm. The Zen tradition actually relies on a different school of aesthetics known as wabi-sabi. Wabi-sabi places a lot more of importance on on impermanence, the fact that things do not remain. So and remind us of the fragility of our existence, and remind us, of course, of death and the importance of cherishing the moments we have nowadays in order to attain enlightenment. Right. So these are of course different lenses through which let's say beauty is being perceived. But what's important here is that these two schools do express the values of the same religious tradition, which is Buddhism. And they just represent different aspects of it. And they don't necessarily contradict each other. And so you can have, for example, if you go to Isfahan, apart from the main square that has all these beautiful mosques and palaces, you also have these simple structures made out of bricks, where the bricks are being used with spaces between themselves to actually bring these geometrical patterns about. Now, these are buildings just made out of simple bricks. There's actually no great deal of exuberance going on there, but even there, there's a deep sense of beauty that emerges out of these buildings. So simplicity does not necessarily, have to come at the expense of let's say, beauty, and also simplicity does not necessarily have to conflict with more exuberant forms of Islamic art. It's just that they just fulfill a different purpose, and their purpose still lies within the tradition. Also, keep in mind, the radical left may look at Safavid art and these golden domes and so on and so forth as being completely exaggerated. But I would like to remind everyone that these buildings gave thousands and hundreds of thousands of people jobs. There are entire trades. That are necessary to basically build those buildings. You have entire generations of, for example, glass workers, entire generations of metal beaters, entire generations of blacksmiths, of calligraphers, of tile makers, and so on and so forth, that are necessary to actually create those buildings. And these people, what a lot of people don't know is that a lot of these craftsmen actually organize as guilds, and these guilds actually have, let's say, initiation rituals where the young men who entered those guilds actually taught, ethical values,
right,
and which were reflected in the economy and also in the religious practice of these people. I mean, calligraphers, for example, are supposed to keep wudu whenever they're practicing calligraphy, for example.
Oh, interesting.
And it's an art that is all about self-effacement. I mean, Islamic art. I mean, what you'll find in these quote-unquote exuberant Safavid mosques is that you don't actually find many references to the artists themselves, contrary to modern art. I mean, the huge difference between, for example, the second generation Iranian Canadian, spoken word artist and the Safavid artists who worked in those mosques, is that on the one hand you have this sort of you have this amplification and celebration of the ego and subjectivity going on there, sometimes in a most sort of, I find these things to be quite obscene when people put themselves forward in such a way. I find it quite obscene and quite unbearable. I can't stand it. I just have to, after 1 minute, I just have to basically, stop watching these things. Yeah. And on the other hand, you have these Safavid artists who just basically just
they're very selfless.
They're very, absolutely. It's very self-effaced, because the thing is this: in traditional Islamic art, the problems of the artists are just a storm in a teacup. They don't matter, right? And in a sense, I'd like to link this to what Jordan Peterson often says, right? And this idea of the logos. Well, the idea of the logos. The idea that yes. The idea that the logos, which we also have in Islamic tradition, expresses order, and this order is of course expressed through mathematics in the Islamic tradition. What these artists are doing is that they're driving away chaos. They're driving away the darkness by creating works of art. So they're not putting forward their own problems, their own misery on display in order to create even more darkness into the world, in order to bring even more darkness into the world. What they're actually doing is they're creating beauty in order to heal, our world, which is actually what the purpose. Yeah, absolutely. So because here's the thing, right? We're all trapped in this war between the forces of the intellect and the forces of ignorance. And the job of the artist is actually to be on the side of the forces of the intellect, beauty, of course, being one of the virtues that has to be, manifest in that uh, in that army, the army of light, and then the army of the intellect. So the job of the artist really is to influence entire generations and to really profoundly impact on society. As such, I would actually say that ultimately speaking, Islamic architects and Islamic artists are actually the ultimate politicians and theologians of the Islamic world. Because the thing is this, not everyone has access to the works. Not everyone reads, first of all. Not everyone reads the works of, let's say, Khoja Nasruddin Tusi or Imam Ghazali. But everyone goes to a mosque. Everyone walks through streets, right? So the people who are planning those streets, the people who are planning those cities, planning those mosques, have an impact on the citizens.
Right.
And if they build these cities in a way that is beautiful, they will instill a sense of beauty in the citizens. And you only have to see the impact that go to cities like Yazd, for example, or Isfahan, but especially Yazd, and see the akhlaq of people and compare them to, for example, the akhlaq of the people of Tehran. I don't want to make generalizations, but the differences is actually quite blatant,
Well,
and
I mean,
much of
you
it
could make the
has.
same comparison between, let's say, Istanbul and
Yeah.
Dubai, or
Yeah.
Riyadh and
Yeah.
Cairo.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's.
I mean, there
Yeah.
is again, I don't know if it's a correlation causation thing, but
Mm.
you might have something there. There might be something.
Well, let me put it this way. Let's say I'm teaching in a university that is built in a sort of contemporary modern style. And let's say I'm teaching traditional theology or traditional Islamic philosophy, whatever. There's one important aspect that people don't take into account, which is this, is that the students are being taught by a second teacher, which is the architecture of the building. And the architecture of the building is not speaking to their conscious mind, it's actually speaking to their subconscious mind.
Right.
And the message they're saying is that, your professor who's been telling you about Islamic tradition and stuff, well, yeah, it's all fine and dandy. But at the end of the day, what really matters is that the founders of whatever university, he's teaching in, have chosen this particular style of architecture, and that is really what matters. And this style of architecture is telling you that, first of all, you don't have a soul, there's no hereafter, and all you are about is this. You're a body that is animated by some mysterious form of electricity, and all your lives are about is basically getting a job, contributing to the neoliberal market, and save enough to be able to get a pension and then die.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, so no wonder we have this sort of schizophrenia in the Muslim world when people try, their very best to basically convey Islamic teachings, but the rest of society around them actually says the opposite. The architecture says the opposite. The fast food that they eat says the opposite, and
Right.
so on and so forth. Right. So the architecture plays on the levels of the subconscious, and as long as we don't take these things into account, like, nothing's going to change really.
So the point that you made about cities and their architecture and the subconscious effect of buildings on people. I once made this post on my page about Mecca and how
Yeah.
Mecca has basically been modeled to look a lot like the bastions of individualism. It looks like London, which is a bastion of individualism. They're trying to make it look like New York, or like Dubai, or like Las Vegas, or Toronto,
Yeah.
or what have you. When really, Kaaba is supposed to be, or Mecca is supposed to be, the congregation point of all the people. It is supposed to
Yeah.
be, Umm al-Qura, which
Yeah.
is the mother town. It is supposed to be in the center of the world.
Yeah.
And so there's a kind of a great irony that this is a place where we all congregate to basically dress in our grave clothes and to glorify the oneness of the Creator and the unity of the creation in the adoration of the Creator. And yet
Yeah.
we're looking and acting exactly like the individualists. And in fact, you go to Mecca, you find Starbucks, you find McDonald's. These are the kind of modern idols that
Absolutely.
somebody's going to come and smash in the same way that the messenger smashed the 360
Yeah.
idols of Jahiliyyah.
Yeah. Well,
Go ahead, brother.
yeah. I mean, the sort of, I mean, Darius Shayegan, who wrote this book called Cultural Schizophrenia. The original title in French was Le Regard Mutilé, the mutilated sight. And this is the way how contemporary Muslim societies take tradition and modernity and try to reinterpret tradition through the eyes of modernity, and with devastating consequences. And what's happening in Mecca and other places in the Muslim world is exactly that. You have people who have taken license, without any proper training, have taken license to basically reinterpret the tradition, and who are mutilating it in the same process. And the destruction of historical sites, but most importantly, the imposition of a completely foreign form of architecture that is not adapted to our climates here, and is not adapted to the type of economy and so on and so forth around here. It is pretty much a very visible, let's say, sign of how much we've drifted away from the Islamic tradition. Because here's the thing: for every modern building that's being created in today's Islamic world, there's a whole range of traditional craftsmen, tile makers, blacksmiths, and so on and so forth, who actually are losing their jobs, who have to then leave their villages, live their, let's say, provincial cities to, move to the bigger towns and find employment there as, taxi drivers or whatever. It's a crime. Right. I mean, it's a horrendous crime. And the fact, what really scandalizes me is that our clerical authorities have not uttered a single word about it. This, I think, it's terrible, and they'll have to answer for it on the Day of Judgment, because this is because just beyond the aesthetic aspect, there's also a profound other aspect to it, which is that Islam does come with a specific type of economy. It certainly isn't Marxism, but it certainly isn't neoliberalism either. And the fact that to this day we've not come up yet with a proper definition of what Islamic economy actually really should look like. So I know that, for example, Shaykh Baqir Sadr actually has looked into it, but that discussion still needs to be held and still needs to basically take place. I mean, in Iran at the moment, for example, there are a lot of critics of neoliberalism, but as long as let me put it this way, as long as our ulama only concern themselves with the specifics of fiqh, instead of really looking at the philosophy of economy, I think we won't get out of here, because get out of the situation. Because the thing is this: the aesthetics we're employing nowadays is a reflection of a particular philosophy and a particular economical philosophy that is invading the planet like a poisonous weed. And the idea that that somehow you can be a Muslim and live that sort of lifestyle at the same time is just simply incorrect when one really looks at the sources. And I really am puzzled as to why, the ulama are not taking strong positions regarding this issue. And I think this has to do also with issues of training and, of course, the place they're being given in society. But yes, there's a lack of vision there that I think is deadly.
There's an institutional problem, at least with education, as far as education is concerned. There's very little emphasis put on the social sciences in the Muslim world. It is treated entirely as something that is a personal hobby, or is, in many cases, a university may offer a program in it, but it's very underfunded and it's not professionally taught. So I think that in many cases, these scholars, these clerics that you're referring to, may simply just be naive and ignorant to what is happening around them. Although I also think that there is a malevolent force behind it as well. So, we've been talking now for about an hour and 20 minutes. There's tons and tons of things to think about, but I just wanted, maybe you can leave with this question. What message do you have to aspiring artists, architects, and calligraphers?
Well, I would just say go for it. And I'm saying this because I've seen lives being transformed by the practice of traditional Islamic art and architecture in a positive way. I mean, I had students of mine who were really sleeping, and then when they came in contact with traditional Islamic art and architecture, there's this awakening that takes place, and it's really beautiful because not only are they awakening to art, but they're also awakening to the fact that they have a spiritual dimension, that they have a fitrah, and that God loves them, and it's extremely deep. And I have former students of mine who've actually created their own, companies using, where they sell Islamic art. They produce them, they create themselves. So it's definitely something I would definitely encourage, because the thing is, more than anything else, that is exactly what the Muslim world needs nowadays. We need artists. We need people who create beauty. One of the reasons why, I mean, we go back to Japan here, but one of the reasons why the samurai was so much into calligraphy and painting and poetry is that they believed that arts, beauty, cleansed their souls, cleansed their hearts from all the blood they had seen on the battlefield. And especially our societies that have been plagued with so many recent wars. I mean, just think of Iraq, for example, my beloved Iraq. Just think of Syria, just think of Libya, just think of Palestine. All of these societies have been plagued by monstrous events, right? And yes, you can repair the infrastructure, but how do you repair the hearts? Because these hearts, if they go unrepaired, this is only going to create even more tensions for the future, and that is why artists and especially architects are going to be extremely important. Unfortunately, they're not being given the right, they're not being given all the importance right now. But that shouldn't discourage. That shouldn't discourage young artists. Just go ahead. And know that by flooding the world with beauty, you're actually doing God's work. Dostoevsky has this beautiful sentence in one of his novels. It says, "Beauty will save the world," and of course, by beauty he means God's beauty. And there's a redemptive aspect to beauty in the Islamic tradition. It's there to repair the hearts. Let me give you an example. people who suffer from depression in Iran, very often when they go to their therapist, they're being told to practice calligraphy. What is calligraphy? You're practicing the act of writing by applying very strict rules on the measurements and the proportion of the letters. And this goes back to what Jordan Peterson's advice on like cleaning your room, right? There's this space that you have over which you have control, where you're exerting order and beauty. And this is the start of your healing process, because if you can do this on a piece of paper, you can apply this to your own character as well. And calligraphy has, I'm a practitioner of calligraphy, and God knows my life has been through several, let's say, difficult moments, quite dramatic ones actually. And calligraphy has been my, has been essential in my ability to overcome those trials. So I would definitely tell these young people to go for it but of course also make sure that the training that you get is actually thorough. What I do very often find on especially in the diaspora is, for example, people who copy patterns with brushes and then think that they're doing Islamic art, and I very often even have the audacity of selling those patterns. Well, no, that's not how it works. You have to undergo proper training. So there are some institutions that offer it. In the West, I would definitely recommend the Princess School in London, which is actually an institution was created by Prince Charles.
Right.
And it trains people both in Western traditional arts, but also Islamic traditional arts. And it also takes great care in training people on how to basically use those skills to create their own, to create their own jobs, to create their own companies, basically, their own business. And actually quite successful. I mean, one of my friends here locally, he was trained in the Princess School. And he went back to his little town in Sindh, in Nasirpur, and created a tile factory that produces only traditional tiles for buildings, and it's actually being very successful. So don't be discouraged by the voices that tell you that it's not the way to go. So go for it, but make sure that the training you get is actually the proper training. I would definitely discourage people to, I would definitely discourage people to teach themselves these sort of things, because that doesn't work. That's never been how it's worked in the Islamic tradition. If you're going to go through it, then it has to be done the traditional way, with a teacher who actually teaches you a properly qualified teacher who teaches you all of these things, and gives you an ijaza, a permission to basically practice those arts. As long as you keep within those parameters, yeah, absolutely go for it.
You mentioned quite a few things there. First of all, Prince Charles, there's a lecture of his called Islam and Environmentalism, or Islam and the Environment. You can find it on YouTube. Yeah. Highly recommend that everybody check it out. May Allah guide him.
Yeah.
He's someone that's certainly been blessed with a lot of insight on this subject.
Yeah.
Second of all, you mentioned the therapeutic function of Islamic art and architecture and calligraphy. A personal story, a number of years ago, I was diagnosed with clinical depression, and definitely one of the first pieces of advice that I was given by a Muslim psychotherapist was to write, and to write like actual with my hands, because there's a lot of different parts of your brain that are being used when you're writing with your hands as opposed to when you're typing.
Absolutely.
And specifically, I was, taking inspiration to write in cursive, which I hadn't done in many, many years, and specifically to write with a felt tip pen, which again, we're so used to using the ballpoint pens, which are just pooped out of a factory at
which is heresy.
Exactly.
There's a special Yeah, there's a special place in hell for the one who invented the that type of pen.
Well, it's basically the pen of the Protestant work ethic, I suppose.
Yeah,
Because it's entirely utility based, and there's nothing beautiful about it.
yeah,
I was going to mention that even the Ottomans actually used music to
yeah,
treat those who are mentally ill, and this is
yeah,
in the pre-modern period, where you
yeah,
find that a
absolutely.
lot of those who struggled with mental health issues, uh, they basically attached these kind of music halls, or where they would have plays and where they would play
Yeah,
music, um, to these institutions and these hospitals.
yeah,
Similarly, the patterns are very therapeutic.
yeah,
And I wanted to mention that for those who are interested in da'wah or tabligh of Islam, it's not just through the spoken word. It's through these patterns and this architecture. Because again, beauty is something that transcends argument. It's something that
yeah,
transcends the discourses that take place between different people.
yeah,
And I'm sure there are many people out there who may not stumble across Islam like yourself
yeah,
simply through argument, but stumble across it through art, and then
yeah,
that
yeah,
art begins the journey
yeah,
towards an intellectual understanding of Islam.
yeah, yeah.
So,
I,
yeah,
just yeah, I mean, just a very important remark though is that so the practice of the arts for myself has what is done to me is that um, when we first knew each other, I think I could have been qualified as a somehow bigoted 12er Shi'i. Um, and what calligraphy and illumination has done is that
opened up.
I've really opened up, and especially living in a Muslim country as I'm doing now. I've taken the decision to do hijrah and to move completely to a Muslim country, and these matters of Sunni Shia have absolutely no importance when it comes to the arts. So my teacher's teacher is one of the great Turkish calligraphers who's Sunni. I interact all the time with calligraphers who work from completely different religious horizons than mine, and but we share in the same civilization. We share in the same effort of bringing beauty to people, and that is quite remarkable. And I think there's a correlation between the rise of sectarianism in the Muslim world and the abandonment of our traditional aesthetics, and the rise of individualism in art. It's where it's all about expressing your own views and your own miseries and so on and so forth, and your own victimhood and so on and so forth. Whereas traditional Islamic art isn't about that at all. It's really there's this common language is being used throughout the Islamic world, and masters learn from each other, irrespective of whether you're an Ibadi or a Hanafi Sunni or a 12 Shi'i or a Naqshbandi Sufi. I mean, it doesn't matter in any way whatsoever. What matters is the objectively accepted norms of Islamic calligraphy, the norms of architecture, mathematics, and so on and so forth. That's what really matters.
No, there's something universal about it, certainly.
Absolutely, and I think that one of the keys to combating sectarianism is definitely the practice of the arts. I mean, and I can speak for my own, well, I think one of the big problems regarding my own denomination is that it's become aesthetically extremely ugly, in the sense that, and I'll explain it very shortly. If you look at Safavid architecture, what we consider to be traditional Shia architecture, there's none of this victimhood mentality being expressed in it in any way whatsoever. Yet nowadays, especially when you take into account Indo-Pakistani Shiism and Iraqi Shiism, which a lot of it actually derives from the Indian subcontinent, because at the end of up until the end of the 19th century, most Iraqis were actually Sunnis and converted to Shiism thanks to funding that came from Lucknow. The aesthetics of that sort of identity politics are very disturbing. It's all about the expression of one's own miseries, the expression of one's own, identity grievances. And when all you see is your own pain, you lose sight of God. You lose sight of what really matters. You also lose sight of the universality of the Islamic tradition. And I think that's something that people should really reflect upon. And especially when it comes to the aesthetics of Shiism itself. I see a degradation, really. This whole sort of like victimhood mentality, this sort of dollarism, this emphasis on all these on these kind of really dark moods and the expression of subjective feelings. It's really clouding what the classical Shia tradition really is about, which is basically, it's an esoteric tradition, really, which is about elevating the human being and transforming the human being through an inner alchemy. So this needs to be taken into account.
Well, Mr. Yusuf al-Andalusi, you've given us a lot to think about. I'm sure I'm going to be going over this lesson. Really, it's a lesson. It's not even an interview. I think you've offered a lot to myself and to the listeners, and inshallah I'm going to be watching it again and taking some notes and perhaps posting about it in the near future.
Sure.
So thanks again for joining us. Jazakallahu khairan.
You're welcome.
It was a real pleasure, and inshallah we can do this again in the very near future.
All right.
Okay.
Keep me in your du'as.
Of course, and keep us both in your du'as to all of
Thank
the
you.
listeners. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. Thanks again.
Welcome.